Hello and welcome to the Hacking State podcast. This is your host, Alex Mershak. With me today is Charles Herman. Charles Herman is a philosopher and senior research fellow at the American Institute for Philosophical and Cultural Thought. Charles, thank you for coming on.
My pleasure. Glad to be with you.
Yes, it's good to have you. So we're going to talk today a little bit about a theory that you've been developing, the which is explicated in one of your early Substack posts called A Short Survey of Honor and Dignity. And that is this distinction between what you're calling honor versus dignity cultures. And you're positing that this distinction explains a number of different major pairings in the history of Western thought, Epicureanism versus Stoicism in ancient Greece, as well as Romanticism and Classicism. And then later on, of course, in the sort of modern day split of liberalism versus conservatism, that each of these pairs falls somewhere along these fault line of honor versus dignity. And so to start, I wanted to ask you to first introduce us to the concept of what an honor culture versus a dignity culture is, and why this distinction is so fundamental in your view.
Sure. Um, Honor is basically a matter of receiving esteem.
Hmm.
If you grant esteem to somebody, you're granting honor to that person. And in an honor-based culture, there are certain concepts that are at the ground rock of a good share of behavior. Those three terms that apply to the honor-based group would be trust, respect, and earned merit. I remember one time when I got to Austin from Oklahoma, I was sitting at a bar at Trudy's restaurant off of Guadalupe, and I wound up sitting next door to an Hispanic gentleman. We got into a conversation, and I mentioned to him that I was on disability, and he said, "You don't look like you're disabled. You should be working somewhere." That's that's an honor-based way of saying earned merit. You earn your merit. You don't have any such thing as inherent worth. Whereas dignity-based cultures are based on three concepts as well. One is faith, one is acceptance, and the other one is inherent worth. And inherent worth is really the important one. That's what has granted us the rights that we have, and uh, the fact that all human beings deserve a certain measure of or modicum of respect, and it's those rights that have uh, and the rationalism that tends to go along with them that have caused some disturbances through history. In particular, the Romantic movement was a response to Enlightenment rationalism, and the Enlightenment was the source of our our rights, the source of the concept of modern dignity through Immanuel Kant, uh, and now the conservative versus liberal problem due to the prominence of liberals hawking the rights and and the conservatives not wanting to take them quite so rapidly. LGBTQ rights and so forth.
So if I'm getting this right, the distinction here is that, honor-based cultures are your esteem is earned, and they're bound up in notions of duty, whereas dignity-based cultures have this notion of inherent human value, and they're right-based. They're based on the concept of human rights, human rights, which are sort of universal. And because of that, there's some interesting implications that come out of what those cultures value and what individuals are expected to do in each of those different scenarios. So how does it look differently when you're in a dignity based culture versus an honor culture? As far as people climbing up in social status or pursuing different ambitious things or making a life for themselves.
Well, you mentioned status. That's an interesting and important one. Uh, uh, and a legal historian, uh, Sumner Maine. What was his first name? I don't remember his first name. Last name was Maine. William Sumner Maine, I think. Uh, was thinking of status when he suggested that societies have gone from a concept of status into a concept of contract. In terms of honor-based societies, those who have the most honor generally have the most status. The elders generally have greater status than the rest of the inhabitants of a given society. Um, in modern times, with the advent of the contract, the honor-based societies had a real problem with this because they rely on trust and respect, and a contract was basically take it right now and sign in the dotted line or forget it. The honor-based people wanted to know that they had a history of work with these people before they would enter into a contract. They wanted to get a measure of the individuals they were going to be working with. They wanted to build up a relationship of trust. But there you are, you're shown a piece of paper with a sign with a line to sign at the bottom of it, and that's that. Well, the honor-based cultures were having nothing about that. It was hundreds of years before many of them would agree to a contract. Now, even so, today there's still a problem with contracts and the general impression that you want to come to an agreement more rapidly than the honor-based people would prefer. During the Camp David Accords, uh, uh, Clinton wanted to get a deal uh, very badly, and he sort of let that on in the way in which he went about going his business. Yasser Arafat was a good honor-based Palestinian, and he could sense this. I can be very positive that he sensed it entirely, and he probably thought to himself, "This guy wants the deal too badly. What's he got up his sleeve? What's he not telling us?" And so Yasser Arafat denied the contract, even though the conversations had gone on prior to the meeting, and there was a basic sense of agreement that this would be pulled off. But uh, Clinton's insistence on it, I think, had a very dimming effect on Yasser Arafat. So the contract concept comes across in a different format depending on how you're what you're dealing with. It doesn't have to be a contract per se. It can be any kind of an agreement.
Okay, so there's this difference then between kind of social expectations and how things are negotiated. Um, this also comes up in kind of like the perception of like of downside versus of sort of gain versus loss. It seems to me, based on your article, that one of the biggest distinctions is that honor-based cultures do not fear death, or they are more well acquainted with the notion of their own terminality, whereas dignity-based cultures have this almost preventative kind of risk-averse attitude towards life. Can you talk to me a little bit about the perception of upside versus downside in these two cultures?
Well, you're correct to say that the honor-based cultures uh, have a more uh, fate-oriented approach to life and death, whereas the dignity-based peoples have just basically a fear of it. Um, that I think goes a long ways to explaining the rest of your remark. Um, it's um, it's not such a matter of the dignity-based um, having a gainer or win or loss approach. It's just a matter of we want to live forever is the way pundits might put it.
What do you mean by that?
Uh, Dignity-based people want to see life continue. Life is basically good. They have friends. They don't want to lose their friends. Um, uh, uh, a, a very important screen actor and comedian in his 90s once cried out, "I don't want to die. I've got too many friends that I would lose." Uh, Honor-based people are basically saying to themselves, "Well, my time has come, so be it." Quite a distinction between those two. But it's not so much a gain or a loss, except that the dignity base would say it's a loss of the pleasures of life, whereas the honor based don't see it that way.
But doesn't this also carry over into not just matters of life and death, but also risk taking in general within the society? I mean, I can see it both ways. I can see in an honor culture not wanting to take a risk because failure might be seen as dishonorable. While at the same time, you state in the piece, you said that honor promotes ambition, dignity inspires a minimalist social code. And
That was
so,
that was a Rick Khmer.
okay, so you were referencing him.
Sure.
And so, what that tells me then is that, uh, for the sake of honor, one might be willing to take on more risks. Whereas in a dignity based system, if I already have inherent human value just by being alive, maybe I'm less inclined to take risks, to be more ambitious, to kind of try to forward myself. What do you think of that?
Well, being risk averse or risk friendly is not something that is distinguished in the honor dignity binary so much. And the reason why is that in order to say that a trait is honor based, it needs to be represented, say, at a level of 60% through the public. Something that is evenly divided between honor based and dignity based is not going to show up on the radar, as it were. And in the case of uh, risk averse versus risk friendliness, uh, both cultures have an even regard for risk. There are always going to be some places where an honor based person considers something risky and where they consider something to be risk friendly. And the same thing goes with the dignity based. So I don't see either of those as particularly honor based or dignity based.
Well, you said that honor based cultures make up approximately 90% of the present world population, right?
That's right.
So that means that there's actually very few dignity based cultures,
That's
proportionally
right.
speaking.
That's right. Mainly from the Enlightenment period.
Right. So mainly sort of post enlightenment.
And we
Uh,
can get even more accurate by saying that it boils down for the most part to Western Europe and the English colonies that are now independent nations.
and you're saying the attitude towards risk aversion is identical between that 90% and that 10%.
Pretty much, there's not each culture has things that are risk averse that they're risk averse to and risk friendly to, and I can't say that in any one culture that the risk averse outweighs the risk friendly in any particular manner. When we deal with risk averse, we're not dealing with an average. We're dealing with something that is not common or ordinarily seen. And when we deal with risk friendly, that's somewhat the same thing as well.
Mm.
So there's not enough to display a difference that we would say that the honor based are more risk averse than the dignity based, or dignity based are more risk friendly than the honor based. I just don't see that.
Given that the majority of the world is honor based, do you think that there is a case to be made that the honor based system of culture is more adaptive in the long term?
No, not necessarily. It is adapted very well given that it has been stable and vibrant for all this time, but it's not necessarily more adaptive. Uh, as of 1600, the West were obviously much more adaptive and overtook the honor-based countries by leap years. Now, China is now catching up only as of late with Xi Jinping and his predecessor seeing the reality that markets are necessary after all. Well, hello. Uh, uh, and the question now is what form of government is more adapted to adaptability? And there are some who say that the Chinese is going to overtake us because they have a top-down structure, which, if it is intelligent, is going to put money where the most important things are, and they're not going to have to worry about a public that is against it for the most part because they can fight protests pretty effectively, and they have basically a police culture to keep watch over everybody, and everybody is aware of that. So the issue is in this topic that you brought up, which is a good one. Um, are we really dealing with a form of government that is allowing us to be more or less adaptable? And I think even here, though you would think that the honor-based people have a net uh, advantage, I don't actually think that that's going to be played out that way in the future. I think that the democracies are going to get their act together and and have governance that is that merits the adaptive function. Uh, the abundance idea coming from the left, I think, is a great way to approach this. They want abundance in terms of technology and so forth, and they want the government to respect that fact and promote it.
Mm,
Um, and the government has been doing that. Think of the government support of Elon Musk, for example.
sure,
Their
sure.
support of the independent uh, the independent space ventures in general. But it goes beyond that to support of electric uh, vehicles, though Trump is not in support of that. But I think in the long run, people will take technology for what it's worth and support it. And I think that's going to be necessary to compete with China.
One distinction that I noticed between the honor cultures and the dignity cultures is this expectation that are put on individuals. You mentioned at the beginning of this talk this interaction that you had with this gentleman about going on disability, right? And one area that I view the dignity cultures might be weak in, and that I think is maybe a problem just from a pure game theoretic perspective, regardless of your moral qualms, is the susceptibility of dignity cultures to free riders, right? That is, how do they deal with individuals who are not pulling their own weight in the society, given that you have this underlying assumption that everyone has inherent human dignity and therefore is entitled to a certain modicum of well-being and material comforts and so on and so forth. I see, for example, in Europe with their problems of immigration, this is clearly an issue. If you invite a bunch of people into your society that maybe are from an honor culture, but are then not actually participating gainfully in the society or in the economy, it seems like the only real response that dignity cultures have is to nonetheless continue to support them. You could see how this would create a free rider dynamic. Do you think that this is a real vulnerability of the dignity based cultures?
No, because the honor-based cultures basically took charge, and
What do you mean
Pre-
by that?
President Trump is basically an honor-based president.
Sure.
And
Well, but that's in
the,
America.
the Europeans have put uh, a limit on immigration for the
Hmm.
most part. Germany
Yeah.
and Sweden have learned their mistakes on that score, and Hungary was belligerent about it right from the get-go. And the Eastern European countries followed suit to Hungary. So basically, the conservatives answered the call to shut down immigration, and Trump went right along with them. So far as immigration is concerned, I don't see that that's going to be a problem moving forward. I think everybody's learned their lesson.
Well, but if you say that the honor-based, uh, people were put in charge, that tells you that it is a vulnerability of the dignity-based framework, at least.
Oh, sure, sure, there's no question about that. The dignity-based people were too lax.
Mhm.
It may very well be because, of the respect concept of dignity. But, dignity basically has to be pragmatic, and, Republicans have to learn that, and liberals have been learning that owing to the immigration crisis. Um, for example, take the conservative mantra against abortion. Uh, to a dignity-based theorist, such as I am, uh, women have rights, but so do babies have rights. In other words, life the right to life is an inherent human right. The right to one use of one's body is an inherent right to women. So what gives? Well, nothing really gives. You have to allow abortion, but you also have to allow for life. Now, how do you do this? You allow abortion under very strict conditions, and that's all you can do. That's the answer to the problem is what are those restrictions going to amount to? What's going to be the even cut between the two sides? That's the war that we're going to have at law through the next two or three decades. And I think that the in the end, both abortion and life will be equally recognized, and abortion will be very strongly restricted. But you will have a right to abortion, and
Okay.
it's pragmatic. That's a pragmatic way of looking at things.
Do you think that the dignity framework is threatened at all by the loss of a metaphysical foundation? That is the loss of belief in God, the rise in secularism, that's been happening over the last, couple hundred years or so. Given that the notion of inherent human dignity was based on Christian universalism.
Well, it in terms of Kant, it wasn't. But, in terms of, a good share of, dignity-based theorizing, a lot of it is based on, Christianity. I mean, Christianity was the first dignity-based religion
Mhm.
when you, come right down to it. So, not to belittle your point, it's just not the only, aspect uh, to the story.
Well, where do you draw this dignity based notion from Kant? Does it come out of the categorical imperative?
It just comes out of, his thoughts on, what, what human beings, are. He feels that human beings are distinguished species on the planet, and uh, they are special for certain reasons that give them a right to one another's respectability. Um, and he basically says that dignities that the humans are their own end. Uh, there is no price to be put on a human life. Those are his remarks, not mine, but I would echo them. So he basically put dignity on the map. The word dignity and the concept of dignity metaphysically. He put it on the map. Now, that doesn't mean that it wasn't metaphysically done by Christianity because uh, it was a metaphysical concept that God would so accept mankind that he would grant dignity to everyone evenly.
Well, but where is it derived from? Is it just taken axiomatically to be the case?
Yes. Yes, it's axiomatically is a good way to put it. It's an a priori judgment.
So it's not tied to like the human faculty for reasoning. There's not like a distinction drawn. I mean, he's basically
To some extent,
setting man apart from the animals in some way, right?
to some extent it was, but that was more to indicate that man deserves to run roughshod over nature because
Mm,
of his reasoning capacities. That was not strictly speaking the metaphysical reason for universal dignity.
mm.
Of
Okay,
course,
so that's
for
a
example,
separate
you had
discussion.
yeah, you had uh, Cicero or Cicero uh, arguing that humans have a larger responsibility in the world, given that they have a rational mind. That's not the metaphysical foundation for dignity. Pico della Mirandola came a little bit closer to that in his oration on dignity. Yet he mentioned dignity only one time in that oration. Um, so he wasn't arguing it quite all the way
Hmm.
metaphysically, but he brought out certain aspects of it that made him famous for precisely that. But it was Kant who gave the metaphysics of dignity, and it was Christianity that did it in terms of religion.
Right, right. So do you think that it sounds to me like you're optimistic about the you know, longevity of dignity cultures, even though they're relatively new in terms of humanity.
That's true. Well, over the past 300-400 years, we've had nothing but progress in a dignity-based sense. Now, there's only so much progress that is theoretically possible, and we have reached that acme for the most part. There are people who invent new rights to this, that, or the other that are not pragmatically based.
Hmm.
Uh, they're almost beyond discussion, and I'm not even going to mention them because they're not worth mentioning. Um, we have outlined uh, substantially. I won't say that there isn't a possibility of another one coming along that is a valid human right, but we've substantially gotten to the end of the rope. Uh, the vast number of them, 30 some of them, were mentioned in the Declaration of Human Rights in 1947. Uh, Add a couple of rights to that, abortion and a couple of others, and you've basically got to your limit. You're not your limit. Now, at this point, we've got them stated, we've got them on paper. Not everybody's obeying them. A lot of the people signed that signatory uh, uh, United Nations document just to be seen with as being on the up and up. They didn't really take them seriously. So the discussion right now is not whether we've got too many rights or whether we've got uh, a potential for so many more rights that we don't know what we're going to do when we come to that point. No, none of that's in the offing. What's in the offing now is the people who are not respecting those rights right now. Are they ever going to respect those rights? That's the issue. And the position that I take is that the dignity base are going to have to be very careful how they peddle their wares because the honor based are not very fast to change. They're very slow moving, very much like a snail. They move at a very slow pace. So you have to entice them over a period of time. Just like democracy is an acquired taste. You don't just announce it and people go for it, flocking and so forth. That's happened once or twice, but it's not a generality at all. Uh, and whereas we had a number of democracies come into the limelight in the 20th century, we're having a retraction from them into illiberal democracies at the present moment, and it's taking steam. It's gaining steam rather than losing steam. So that's something that the dignity-based people have to take strong measure of, and be very careful in how they present themselves to the rest of the world. Uh, it's one thing to parrot your advantages. It's another to parrot things that people don't have an interest in.
Sure, sure. So we've talked a little bit about this kind of tension between honor based and dignity based within a culture, and so I just wanted to clarify for the listeners that, or give you the opportunity to clarify rather that there's going to be a mix of both honor based and dignity based uh, systems, cultural ideals, and individuals and institutions in every society, correct? And when
That's
we're
correct.
talking about an honor based or a uh, dignity based culture, we're really just talking about the sort of predominant framework for that society.
That's correct. Well
Okay.
put.
Uh, do you uh, so 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 what that implies then is that there there can be a shift, right? You could see a dignity-based culture return to being honor-based, and we've of course presumably seen honor-based cultures transform into dignity cultures.
That's correct. That's
Similar,
correct.
yeah.
That's correct.
So how do you see that process happening?
I see it slowing down very remarkably uh, with the split between the liberals and the conservatives, uh, and between the Western and Eastern Europeans becoming sharper and sharper. Uh, uh, I don't see there's going to be anything but an intensification of present trends for the next 20, 30 years. So the the liberals and the dignity-based have a sales job to do, and they're going to have to be careful how they sell their wares because they've got a formidable foe, and that's just all there is to it. It's a very formidable foe. They have 90% of the world's population, for God's sakes. That's formidable on its own, let alone anything else we bring to the table.
Sure, sure. So they're gonna have to make their arguments, of course, and you know, convince other. I mean, at the very least, those seem to be the most powerful societies at the moment. Maybe that's changing a little bit with China, as you discussed. Um, I would also wonder, where do you place Japan in this framework? Because I think Japan is generally viewed as an honor-based culture,
That's correct.
probably one of the strongest honor-based cultures. And yet they seem to have adopted a lot of modern Western ideas. They've had a market economy for a very long time. What do you think about Japan as this sort of hybrid?
Well, they are a hybrid. They are predominantly honor-based still. What makes a dignity-based society is actually, in my classificatory schema, others would have a different point of view on this, but I believe that it's in the constitutional documents. If a society has it written down that the citizens have rights, civil rights, that there is uh, a um, what's the name for it? Uh, uh, my memory is failing me right now. Um, uh, I thought I had it on my tongue just then. Anyway, it'll come back. Uh, there is a now I lost my train of
Like
thought.
a mandate. I'm not sure what you're looking for, but I mean, I'm willing to run with this idea of like if it's written down in their constitution, except for the fact that the constitution is not really necessarily determinate of the actual
That's true.
values of the society, right? There are lots of examples, especially in South America, for example,
That's true.
constitutions and constitutional rights that are not actually
In Russia,
enforced. Sure.
yeah, yeah. Uh, the fact that it's done and that it is agreed to, that latter part is the next thing that has to be mentioned.
Mm.
That is taken seriously. Uh, that is what grants dignity-based status, because that presumes the metaphysical doctrine that everybody deserves a certain amount of respect, and in this particular society, we're going to put that in the terms of civil rights and due process is what I was trying to come up with.
Ah,
Or due process is a very important part of this. So uh, I'm glad I finally remembered that.
so due process, civil rights, kind of the rule of law, basically, with these caveats, right? Of course, you can have the rule of law in an honor-based culture, but what the rule of law means looks very different.
Right, right.
How did you come to this framework?
Well, back in school, I took an anthropology course and I read fairly widely, and not not a little of it came from reading Nietzsche. Uh, in the Birth of Tragedy,
Mhm.
Nietzsche talks about the Apollinian and Dionysian. The Apollinian being Nietzsche's pronunciation and spelling, by the way. Most people say it Apollonian, but I'll use Apollinian in recognition of Nietzsche. Uh, I don't agree with a lot of what Nietzsche said, but credit where credit is due. Um, uh, he he did not express in his earlier writings that the Apollonian Dionysian were a composite in each individual and in each culture. He seemed to suggest that there was either you were either Dionysian or you were Apollonian, and Wagner was the apex of the Apollonian of the Dionysian until Nietzsche discovered that he was an anti-Semite. That was the biggest blow to Nietzsche in his own theoretical work that he could possibly imagine. In fact, he immolated himself in the introduction to his second edition of that book. He said that everything that I had done in that first edition was just totally screwed up. That's basically what he was saying in that introduction. It was really quite interesting to read that. Um, but he had denominated Goethe as an Apollinian, and and worse than that, he was sentimental. That was the worst thing that Nietzsche could say about anybody, was that they were sentimental. Nietzsche carried that through his entire writing career. He hated sentimentalism, hated it, absolutely hated it. There was nothing that he hated more than that. He hated that more than he hated the moral discourse of Germany at the time. Sentimentalism was out, but he wound up having to change his mind about a few things. He came up in the Gay Science to apologize publicly to Goethe, and he also uh, put Wagner in the proper sense, and he also came to the conclusion that there were Dionysic and Apollinian traits in everybody, and that it was a measure of which one took predominance. All of this is in the interim between the birth of tragedy and the gay science. But in the gay science, he came out with it.
In The Birth of Tragedy, wasn't he describing the Apollonian and Dionysian elements as being combined in Greek tragedy?
Yes, I think he was.
So, so they were not completely distinct
That's right.
among different cultures. Well, or maybe Greek tragedy was the exponent of this of the dynamism of bringing these two forces together.
Yeah, yeah.
So, but walk me through then. How do I get from uh, the Apollonian and Dionysian in The Birth of Tragedy to honor versus dignity? Where do those begin to connect?
All right. Uh, Ruth Benedict wrote a book on on Dionysian and Apollinian cultures, and the uh, the Apollinian cultures would have been dignity based, and the uh, Dionysic cultures would have been honor based. Um, that's the linkage. Was her system of taking Nietzsche's ideas and converting it into cultural dynamics, and in the process of doing that, she also had a guilt shame uh, 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 uh,
Di-
binary
Mhm.
that she the thought was even more important than the Apollinian Dionysian. She applied that just to peculiar uh, cultures. She wasn't referring. She wasn't intending to refer that across the board to all cultures. That is to say that all cultures would be Apollinian or Dionysian. That was just a certain few cultures that she mentioned in that book. Patterns of Culture was the title of the book. I can show you the book cover if you want. Uh, but it was a bestseller, and the 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 uh, the binary that she really took seriously was this one, from the chrysanthemum and the sword. She was asked to write this book by the military in the early 40s. They wanted to know what they could expect from the Japanese military based on Japanese culture. So they asked her to compile a cultural overview of Japan. And this book is what resulted. It's published in 1946 by Dutton. And this book was a classic off the press and has remained a classic. And yet she never set foot in Japan to write this book. She dealt with library studies. Studies. There were several people who had been doing their work in Japan and wrote up their monographs, and she was taking advantage of that. So to write this book, but the shame guilt culture idea was hers and hers alone, and she spread it to her student Margaret Mead, who became the most famous anthropologist of the 20th century. But the uh, the honor, the shame guilt cultures, the shame was the honor based, the guilt was the dignity based, uh, and and that's even a closer combination than the other with the Apollonian and Dionysian.
Mhm. And the distinction here is, shame is social, whereas guilt is personal.
That would be one way of putting it. Yeah, sure.
Mhm. Like, to be ashamed of something means to experience kind of the social consequences of having done something wrong.
A faux pas.
Yes,
Oh,
whereas to be guilty is something that you feel on an individual level.
yes.
Um, I remember having a conversation about this distinction in one of my seminars in college, and I would bet that it came from here, even though we were not referencing this anthropologist directly. So okay, so I have the Apollonian and the Dionysian. I have guilt versus shame, and then I have honor versus dignity, and that's sort
By
of
the way, the guilt versus shame is a dimension that comes under honor and dignity.
right, right. I was going to say that. So guilt versus shame is actually like a sub. Yeah, is the dimension is a good way of saying it. How do I I'm still trapped up on how do I get Apollonian over to dignity and Dionysian over to honor? What are the characteristics or attributes that they share?
Well, the Apollonian is uh, somewhat more sentimental, more artistic. Um, buoys one up when one's depressed. And by the way, he took these over from Schopenhauer. That's where they came from originally.
Mhm.
Uh, and dignity psychology is not too uh, far flung from what I just mentioned for the Apollonian. Um, the Dionysian um, that is more like the Mediterranean honor cultures that Orit Khmer was referencing, um, where uh, there's a certain negative uh, implication about the honor-based societies that they're somehow backward, uh, uh, more more a matter of from the brute rather than the human in certain regards, and uh, that again was taken from the Mediterranean, and that is not very representative of honor-based cultures worldwide. So, but that would come more closely to the Dionysian. That's what you would find in a Mediterranean society. You would find less risk averseness, a tendency toward quarrelsomeness, a tendency toward blusterness. Uh, uh, these are characteristics that could be found in Wagner.
Mm. Okay, interesting. Do you tie these these sort of cultural modes back to any kind of like notions of like human biology or um different climates or how these might affect different traits of at a population level?
Sure, there's a couple of things to mention. Um, um, let me start with a particular culture that I classify as intermediate mixed. An intermediate mixed honor-based culture is an honor-based culture in which you have two different groups of people with different behavioral traits. One is they're both honor-based, but one is cooperative, quiet, and the other one is cooperative, uh, competitive. And the competitive is louder than the cooperative, which is called quiet. The classification system goes from quiet cultures to loud cultures across the honor-based panorama.
What culture is this?
Honor-based cultures are quiet up to loud, and in the quiet cultures, those are cooperative or competitive. In the intermediate loud, you have the intermediate mixed and intermediate composite. So we're talking about the intermediate mixed, where you have two honor-based groups, but which have different behavioral traits, and they know that, and they actually have produced
What what
defined
what
characteristics.
culture specifically are you talking about, though?
This culture is the Localite culture from New Britain,
Oh, okay.
uh, and the majority culture is probably 80% of the population. Minority culture being the remainder.
Mhm.
The minority culture is as described better than the DSM-5 description of bipolar. It takes all the major uh, traits that the DSM-5 listed. DSM-5 works off of a set of traits, and then they have a core set of traits within that. And then if you find your patient having certain number, say 4 or 5 out of 8 core
Yeah.
traits, then
Mhm.
that is indicative of a condition. It's not a proof of that condition. You have to go through it, a uh, a differential diagnosis, but that gives you your hunch. Uh, the same thing is here. The 20% uh, was given about 8 characteristic traits, and you could define that bipolar culture by taking some people with 3 or 4 of those 8 as a good uh, 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 uh,
Indicator.
indicator, rule of thumb, if you will. Thank you. Um, so that bipolar set of characteristics comes from stress, environmental stress, and some people respond to it reasonably well and don't get any bipolar symptoms. Other people don't respond to it very well and get the stressful response, which is a bipolar cavalcade of traits. I don't say symptoms because they're really traits, and combinations of traits can produce symptoms. Um, Now, if you take a look at Russia, well, above the 56th parallel latitude, um, you will find that they have a much higher incidence of bipolar traits. And again, this is very probably from the stress of the climate. And if you take a look at Russian authors, you will find that characters tend to be tend to be honor based. No, it's just Freudian slip. Tend to be bipolar.
Mm.
You find bipolar traits all over the place in Dostoevsky's characters. Um, so that's one link between honor, dignity, and and behavior and environment. Um, there's going to be even in a dignity-based country about a 3% or lower incidence of bipolarity, but in this particular culture, it was 20% in evidence, which is quite a lot of stress for that for that population. It shows how individuals are individualistic as to how they deal with stress, and shows the same thing for Russia. And it's interesting that that across the 56th degree parallel latitude, uh, that all the way across that, you find the same thing in all those cultures. You find dignity, you find um, um, bipolar traits above the 56th latitude, much more pronounced. So, for example, you have uh, in some cultures uh, the what they call them shamanistic uh, uh, schizophrenic outbursts, things like that. Those that happens a lot higher in latitudes over 55, over 55 or 56 degrees latitude.
Mm. So so there are some differences then in behavioral traits that are between these cultures in terms of what's likely to make them honor based versus dignity based. Is that right?
And also, going back to Benedict's book, Patterns of Culture, the Pacific Northwest coast,
Mhm.
the with the uh, Dionysian culture, and they could be considered to be under greater stress than the other cultures. But that's a looser uh, association. But I thought I'd mention it.
So I guess what I'm asking though is because like what you were discussing before was differences between groups within honor based systems.
Yeah,
Um, but it sounds like the general trend is the more environmental stress, the more honor based
adaptability.
adaptation you have.
Yeah, yeah. The more about
Okay.
you have, and the
Yeah.
Anabic people, generally speaking, uh, are going to be found in these higher elevations.
Yeah. And well, what's interesting too is that in the dignity based culture, you have honor based traits or these traits that are adaptive under conditions of stress being seen as maladaptive or pathological.
Yeah, some would go there.
Yeah. Well, in the case of DSM, diagnostic criteria, right?
Uh, yeah, I think there's some incidents. There's some amongst the far right. I think there's a higher incidence of bipolarity, but I would not want to suggest what the percentages are.
I wonder what the incidences of other mental illnesses are among the far left.
Uh,
um,
I would imagine they're probably up there also.
yeah, yeah. In general, extreme ideologies tend to attract very extreme
Right.
personalities.
Yeah, that's right.
So where do you think, so you've written on this framework, you've thought about it quite a lot, you've studied a lot. Where do you think this gets us? How do you think this framing of honor-based versus dignity-based cultures helps kind of move discourse forward? Do you think it's just an interesting intellectual exercise, or do you think it really is informative in terms of thinking about our own culture, society, how we could do things better?
Well, I would say both. Um, One of the problems that we have is that, first of all, it has to be recognized that the problems that we have in our own country are due to dignity based versus honor based traits. It's not due to anything other than those. I am
Really?
very, I'm completely convinced of that.
Mm.
It is the left being dignity based, focusing on their rights, the conservatives not wanting to focus on those rights, um, and uh, the the culture wars is essentially a war over culture, over dignity and honor. Um, Now, the I wrote up some note cards here to uh, give me some assistance in this. Um, the far right groups, some of them have been the subject of some debates recently, and in one of them, you had an interview of Jonathan Keeperman by Ross Douthat,
Mhm.
and um, Keeperman mentions that conservative art is bad art, and he goes to say that uh, the conservatives have stressed moralisms in their art. It's too much. It's much too moralistic, he says. It's didactic. It is always trying to tell you a self-consciously conservative message. It's overly sentimental. Then he mentions the traditional aspect. It's always looking backward. Conservative art is always looking to the past because it's familiar. It's something that's already been established. These are fundamental traits of honor-based societies, moralistic, traditional. Then he goes into personal and group identity. Uh, it's grievance-oriented. This comes in two forms. It's either we're owning the libs or there's a story about all the ways the libs are making our lives unbearable. Uh, those are two more. So between the four of those are all major core traits. out of 15 traits that you can assign to honor dignity based, there are 8 traits, and those are 4 of the 8 traits. So
Hmm.
you could develop just from this interview that we're describing an honor based culture, and uh, and that was not the only one I did, but it's representative of them. Um, the far right and to some extent the conservatives, generally speaking, are honor based.
Okay, sure. So that gives us Jonathan Keeperman, previous guest on the show as well. He came under before he was doxxed under his pseudonym as Lomez, where we talked about the Passage Press. And I, I I take that as a valid example. That's an interesting example, and it shows us how you could sort of take this frame and pick apart uh, someone's arguments based on it and sort of categorize it one way. But do you worry that it's sort of like if I have this frame of I can just go around and categorize everything based on this? But I'm wondering, like, where does that get us? Like, does that improve anything, or does it just?
Well, it tells you where you are, and that's number one. Where
Mhm.
we are is we have a culture war. The issue is not so much why we have a culture war, that I have resolved into the honor dignity conflict.
Yeah,
The issue is how do we address it?
right.
And that's where the honor dignity, comes into it and from a different point of view.
Oh,
Um,
so you think that if we understand it as a fundamental distinction between honor and dignity, then it makes it easier to start having a conversation about the differences.
that's one way of putting it. Another way of putting it is that, uh, there are a number of honor-based traits that dignity-based people would do well to emulate.
Mhm, sure.
Number of dignity-based traits that honor-based people would do well to emulate.
Yeah.
If you show a decided, uh, respect of another culture, you're gonna get along with them. If you do that by taking on some of their traits and discovering that they do you well, you're not gonna be wanting to go to war with them. You're gonna wanna be friends with them,
Mhm.
and you're gonna say, "Okay, we have our differences, but we also understand each other better." So
Right.
I am without question a dignity-based individual, and, uh, and I will confess, outwardly and publicly that there are some honor-based traits that I would do better having myself. And, and I sort of regret that I have not worked harder to make them myself, but I can assure you that I don't get in trouble with any right-wing people because I understand them, and
Hmm.
I'm to understand them, I want to sit down and hear them out.
Sure,
If
sure.
there's only one real fundamental problem that I've got with conservatives in any event, I've only got one one critical comment about them, and apart from that, I think their culture is a delightful culture. I used to live amongst them in a southern town,
Mm.
but, if you just take time to understand something and, realize that there's a respect to go both ways, you're not gonna be making war on on those people. And, the honor-based, dignity-based culture tells you how to identify those things that are apart from you, that are leading you astray from the other culture, and those particular traits that you should start looking out for in the other culture that you might find are beneficial to yourself.
Right, right, exactly. Well, I think that's a good place to leave this conversation off. And people can, chew on and think about the implications of what that might mean, adopting the traits of the other, or at least trying to understand where the other side is coming from. Charles Herman, thank you for coming on the show. Where can people read more of your work and find out more about you?
They can, go to the Substack. They can go to, uh, ssrn.com, Social Sciences Research Network. They can go to researchgate.net, another scholarly site where I post my papers. Um, and they can go to academia.edu. At each of those, I've got 50 to 70 articles that they can chew on.
Excellent, excellent. That's Charles Herman, Herrman .substack.com. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me, Alex.